Okay, hi everybody. I'm Charlotte, really excited to chat with you today. As Michelle mentioned, I'm an associate partner with McKinsey, and I spend all of my time with tech companies thinking about what is an agentic organization? What do we think about from a skill, talent, basically human perspective when we think about the impact of AI? So I'll give you some stories as we go today on what we're seeing from at least more of the leading edge tech companies in the Bay that are moving fast on this one, and excited to share what we've heard so far.
Awesome, and hi everyone, my name's John Chartier. I'm a partner out of our Boston office. I've been with McKinsey for 15 years, and I'm one of the leaders of our talent client service. I also am one of the partner sponsors for our own, we have a talent attraction function. We have 900 recruiters. We screen a little over 1.3 million applications a year. And so happy to talk about the stuff that we're doing and what's working and what's not working on that front, in addition to what Charlotte talked about. How do we talk to our clients about what the future of the agentic organization looks like?
Awesome, thank you. All right, so let's get into it. And I know you all have been hearing about AI ad nauseum all day, but over probably the last year plus. So I think we'll anchor in some of the data to start, but then we'll spend most of the time talking about what are we seeing in practice, and feel free to ask questions as we go as well. But unsurprisingly, this is the biggest shift that at least I have experienced, I think most of us will experience when it comes to the impact on the workforce, and it's coming fast. So our clients that are actually performing in this moment are really starting to rewire workflows, are thinking differently about the roles and skills of the future, because they recognize you can't just wait to see how things evolve, you need to move now. And so I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is like, we don't know all the answers. We're getting a starting point sense of where folks are headed, but I think this group actually has such a chance to get ahead of the curve here and start to lead from the front as we think about what the impact could be. And I've said that every day now I think, that the role of the CHRO has literally never been more important as we think about how AI is impacting the workforce, both in terms of tech adoption, of course, but like reskilling at scale. What does job architecture look like? How do we get our folks motivated and excited about this new future? So I think I'm jealous of each of you as you're thinking about this next chapter. Here are some of the stats that we are, let's call it, seeing from the pseudo front line of where our organizations are headed. I think what I would say first and foremost, nearly every single job is going to be reshaped by AI. I'm not saying it from the standpoint of those roles are going away, but they are radically transformed. The data says something like 74%. I think that's kind of BS. I think the point is every single knowledge working job is going to look different in 6 months and especially in 2 years. And we need to get ahead of what do we actually want our humans to be doing while agents are supporting them. Beyond that, we're seeing real impact when it comes to org structures. We're seeing broader spans of control, shrinking layers, more kind of humans and agents working together with managers needing to oversee both of those responsibilities. I would say this is like the 35 to 40% of layers being reduced. I'll be honest, that's like early days thinking. I think that we're gonna get to a point of saying, yeah, your average span can probably increase by 3 to 4, but I'm not seeing yet our clients 100% leaning into that. I think we should expect that to come. The stat on here that really gets me excited, though, is this 5-to-1 ratio. So bottom right of the page, which is, in essence, this really is more of a change management play than it is a tech play. The technology either is here or is coming. It's actually about how do we get our people to think differently about not just, oh, I'm going to use ChatGPT, but instead I'm going to rewire how I get my work done, and I'm going to do a lot more with the time that I have rather than, I don't know, hanging out. So more to come on all of these things. And I think how we'll spend the rest of the time is talking about the impact we're seeing in 3 overlapping dimensions. So what we're seeing from a talent and skills perspective, what we're seeing from a structural implications perspective, and kind of most importantly in my mind, what's happening from a culture and change perspective. So John, do you want to talk about the talent side?
Would love to. And I think probably coming into today, but I'm sure as you're going through and listening to everybody talk, I'm sure the takeaway is AI is going to be so fundamental in terms of what's shifting. I think the message that we would share and we'd like to talk a little bit about is the fact that that is true, and it's not going to be totally equal when it comes to all these different jobs, to the point that Charlotte makes. So if you let us nerd out a little bit, we brought some data from our Global Institute to try to help play the movie forward and say, okay, what does this actually mean in terms of the future of talent and roles? So maybe a couple of things. What I would say is the takeaway is humans are here to stay. The workforce of the future is going to be a workforce of and, where it's workforce of people, and of robots, and of agents. And how do we help our workforce and our people managers to understand what it means to lead in a situation like that? And maybe just to anchor a couple of data points. One, we stepped back and said, okay, how do we actually think about what the future of the workforce looks like, and how do we start to wrap our heads around what that means? And so what we looked at was, of all of the work that happens, what do we think is technically automatable? And so if you look below the x-axis here, we think about 57% of work is technically automatable at some point. We'll talk a little bit about timing in a couple minutes. 13% of it requires some type of physical capacity. That means we need a robot. And 44% means we don't. That means we can have an agent. But what that also means is there is a huge bolus of work, and we'll talk in a second about this in more detail, that is going to be hybrid and will require a bit of this. So when we think about how do we equip people managers in the future, it's going to be how do we build capabilities for people to be able to work across each of these different components in terms of how do they actually drive a workforce. And by the way, when we then play the movie forward and say, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of timing? I'm sure for many of you, you have the same reaction that we do, which is it feels like all of this is changing overnight. It's going really fast. But one of the things we thought about was, okay, if we snap the line, let's pretend it's 2030. What do we actually think the work shift in terms of different roles is happening? Because one of the things that's a little bit of a pitfall when we talk about AI and we talk about the future of the workforce is we're oftentimes talking about activities. We're not talking about roles. We're not talking about people. And so that can create a little bit of a fallacy in terms of what's shifting. So we said, look, if we actually then look at people or roles, what do we think the shift is going to look like? And so if we play the movie forward and we say, okay, for those roles that are going to become the most automatable, what do we think the order of magnitude is? And we think it's something like 12% of roles that are 35% or more automatable. It's like a little bit of a tongue twister in terms of numbers. But anyway, my reaction to that is it was lower than I would have thought. Yeah. And the second knock-on implication is the big bolus of roles, we think north of 75%, are going to be roles that continue to include humans. And so as we think about what the future of this looks like, it's really going to be about how do we enable people managers to be able to upskill those individuals in the large majority of roles to understand how do they work alongside these agents, how do they work as people managers for these different individuals to be able to drive the same type of capabilities while also performing the types of roles that are uniquely human. And by the way, this will take several different flavors, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but in the left bucket, this is that small percentage where there is a large amount of this that can be automated. So the question there becomes, for the individuals that were in those roles before, where there may be agents in the future, how do we actually think about reskilling those individuals? What does that look like in terms of the types of roles that they'll then go into, and how do we make sure that we're building our ability as an organization to be able to enable that? The second, for that big bolus, that big bucket of roles that's being reshaped, how do we reskill, upskill the individuals in that to be able to work with agents, to be able to be fluent? And then finally, we'll have this whole net new set of roles that's going to emerge that we're already seeing. How do we make sure that we have the pipeline we need to get that talent? And then, by the way, if you fast forward this, when we think about the world that we're in right now, we're already, for those types of new roles that didn't exist 1, 2, 3 years ago, we're already at a point of an enormous amount of competition. Organizations that look at their ability to fill their talent pipeline, whether that's through upskilling of their own people, whether that's through being unique in terms of how do they actually go out and source talent, that's going to become an enormous strategic differentiator when it comes to being able to win the war on talent, and in particular, the war on talent that enables that workforce of the future, the end. So with that, Charlotte will talk a little bit about operating model implications of what that looks like then when we start to actually develop the org.
And I think what I'll say on the op model front as we get into it is there's a lot of experimentation going on right now. And I think what I'm seeing organizations that are doing a nice job of this are really thinking domain by domain, how can we transform how the work gets done? It starts first with saying, how would we reimagine our workflows? How do we actually operate differently? And I think Katie and the Microsoft crew talked about that this morning, which is it's not just about saying, oh yeah, let's throw some extra humans on this problem, or let's broaden spans and just hope for the best. It actually has to start with almost like the not fun work of process redesign before you get to structural changes. But I think what we are starting to see in the domains that are moving fastest is that it's less about hierarchies and silos as they've existed today, and it's more about outcomes, and how do you actually align teams to the outcomes that they're trying to deliver. So what might that look like? I have one client, if you take the function of HR or the domain of HR, however we want to frame it, they've realized, and this is a 2030 vision that they have, that basically over 50% of the work that their HR professionals are doing today can be agentically led in the future. We did a bunch of workflow mapping to say, what does that actually mean? And where they got down to was actually, we don't need COEs anymore. We're going to align our people teams into product teams, in essence, where we're going to align to a specific outcome. It's probably going to be, for now, about a year, where they're actually just going to transform how that work happens with agents. But they got rid of TA, they got rid of L&D, they got rid of basically all of the dividing lines that were holding them back and said, okay, what are the humans, the agents that need to work together to solve this people problem or this people product? Where they got to is that probably looks like 30% fewer folks in their function, at least for now. But more than that, it looks like bigger jobs, more interesting work, frankly, like a reset of what it means to be an HR professional, because it's not, oh, I do recruiting. It's like, no, I actually solve a range of people challenges, one of which is probably around hiring, but it's also skilling at scale and making sure that folks get productive in their jobs. So I hope that brings to life a little bit how we're seeing the structures evolving. And like, yeah, as a result, it does mean that there's been broader spans of control. There's more almost like tech-first thinking, like a product and platform operating model, I think is starting to manifest in a bunch of different places. But it's solving from outcomes and workflow transformation first, not spans of control, for example. But what it could look like, and so this is another sanitized client example, which is they had a bunch of layers. We show it as 5, but really it was closer to 7 to 8, where they were saying, okay, we think we can broaden our spans of control, at least for most of our work, by somewhere in the order of magnitude of 3 to 5 folks. Why do they think that? They, at least for now, believe that managers can be supported enough by agents so that some of their coaching responsibility or some of their kind of like managerial burden goes away. I'm actually not convinced that spans stay broader. I think that there's a world that the work humans do is more complicated over time, and so therefore spans need to shrink again. But for now, at least, they were able to broaden a bit. And they were able to collapse by 2 layers. Mostly what that meant is because the jobs got bigger and more important and more interesting. So I think to John's point, it's like, yes, things are changing and it can be scary, but it's also a chance for humans to do work that is more impactful or more important or more outcome driven than it's ever been before. And so how do you flip that narrative as you get into it too? And I think to that end, what is the change management responsibilities, John, in this moment?
Hopefully somebody in the room has the right answer, because I think we have good leading indicators, but I think that probably what's come across in a lot of the talks today is this is really a challenge because the degree to which you have to drive change in the organization really has to be about how do you, throughout all layers to what Charlotte's pointing out, throughout all types of the organization, start to drive an understanding of what is going to be different about the way that we work, what is going to be different about people, processes, and systems. And helping to meet people where they are at whatever point in the organization becomes really critical in helping people understand why whatever we're doing is good not only for the organization, it's good for them individually, and they have some starting point to understand how the part of their job that's changing, they're playing a role in helping to understand what that looks like and what that evolution is. And so I think, at this point, when we're having conversations with clients, we usually get the, okay, who's the organization that's figured all of it out? Tell me about it, what do they do, all of this. Unfortunately, I don't think there really is somebody that's figured all of it out. But the part that I think is really important is as you all are thinking about going back to your organization, thinking about what your agenda looks like here, people that are not currently trying something and are not in the sandbox are going to be left behind, even if they have not cracked the entire code. And so thinking about what are the types of things that you want to focus on and how do you actually start thinking about where are the bets that you want to make becomes really critical. That's the first piece. The second piece is thinking about how do you engage the organization, recognizing that the enterprise of the future is not going to be cracked by 2 or 3 C-level executives sitting in a room. It's going to be cracked by mobilizing the whole organization to understand what is it going to take for us to shift from where we are today to whatever the opportunity of tomorrow is. And if we step back for a second and we think about some of those big bets, when we talk to our clients, the question becomes, okay, where do I start? And there's no one size fits all. But one of the things that becomes really important is thinking about, okay, for my organization, when I think about what the value drivers are that are enabled by whatever this future use case is for AI, number one, where are the places where we think we can move the needle the most? And then if I work backwards from that, where are the enablers that I need in order to deliver that where I might not be in the right place today? And so it's less about finding a silver bullet that's going to solve all of your challenges versus being really thoughtful and say, okay, if I take an ROI approach to these different places where I could engage, how do I, one, make sure that I've got enough of a comprehensive view to be able to understand, where are their trade-offs? And two, how do I make sure that I'm helping to facilitate across the board a view of what are the truly most enterprise level priorities versus thinking individually within functions, which is a little bit of a pitfall that we're seeing sometimes is people are taking the perspective of this is what's really critical for my part of the organization, therefore not thinking so much across the board. So across the board, maybe 3 things we hope, if nothing else, you'll take away. Number 1, all of this is not a spectator sport. So if you're in the middle of it, you should be thinking about what does this take? What does it take for me as a leader in the organization? We talk to a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs and ask them, who are the folks that you think should be driving this? Their first answer is, of course, themselves, which is the right answer, because if it weren't that, we'd have a whole other set of problems. But then when you ask them, who do you think should be co-convening it, you'd be surprised. It very infrequently is the CIO. It's the folks that are leading the business. It's the folks that are driving people. It's the folks that are driving HR, because those are the individuals that are going to be helping to architect what does it take to get from where we are to the future. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, think about where are the places where you can make 1 or 2 big bets and start to think about what the future of that looks like, and start to think about how do you start to bring the organization along on that journey. And the third is start thinking about across the organization, how do you bring people along in different pockets? How do you think about telling the story of why this is really exciting from lots of different perspectives, not just from the top or not just from the front line, but across the board?
I think that's totally fair. And I think the only thing that we didn't cover at length today was specifically this one on the HR redesign point. And I do think there's something to be said for the folks in this room of, we need to figure out workforce planning. That's important, figuring out the AI adoption potential. But I also think we talk about this idea of HR as a lighthouse function, because I think in essence, picking HR as actually one of the domains to start with is really important, because you can then put your money where your mouth is a little bit when talking to the business and saying, hey, look at us. Like, we rewired half of how we get our work done. There's a lot of opportunity, whether you go to this HR product model that I was describing, or even just standardizing some of the ways that we get our work done. I think that it's almost like no regrets that I'm seeing with my clients of saying, I, as a CHRO, am going to think differently about how my function works so that I can support you all better. Because my job is to make sure that I'm helping you rewire workflows, rethinking skills, what have you. But I need to, do it first to prove it a little bit. And so I think maybe my push for this room would be, if that's in your remit, a good place to start at least, to do this kind of all in parallel, to be honest, but at least spend a lot of time thinking about how HR is set up to get you moving in that space. Now we've got time for questions. So and any questions from the group? Yeah.
Is this the first time you've ever seen the word ontologist as an important role? I've not seen that before, and so seeing that is really cool. I really like it, but I just have not seen it before. And did it kind of slide up the scale, or suddenly like, boink, ontologist? Like, I just haven't seen it before, but I know what it is. But just curious, I'm like, how did it emerge? Or did it like suddenly appear?
No, it's a really good question. I think the interesting thing, and ontologist is a good example, but we looked back at all of the job postings in the US in 2023 versus in last quarter of 2024, and looked at the different skill sets that were in each of them, what were most common, what were least common, and where did you see biggest areas of growth. And the really interesting thing that we're starting to see, and imagine we'll continue to see the same component of, is a lot of the skill sets and a lot of the roles that are the highest growing now literally didn't exist a year or 2 ago. And so I think part of this is, as we're starting to think about how the workforce evolves, what are the different capabilities we need, organizations, I think, that are taking an open aperture view of what that looks like in terms of what are the roles that they need are going to be the ones that are not only the most agile, but are able to think about how do we fill these gaps in a unique way that, an ontologist is an interesting one. I think there's some other really interesting examples when it comes to, organizations that are thinking about storytelling and how does the role of storytelling play into how do you talk about your workforce of the future. So there's lots of interesting, it's a really, really good thing to point out.
It's ties to the conversation we had yesterday, what do my kids study in college? Maybe ontology is one of the things in storytelling. This is just like, what do you study? If that's an emerging role, then I was trying to think of the answer to that question yesterday.
Yeah. Well, and I think that question, obviously none of us really have the answer to that one, but I think there is something interesting to be said of like, what's become more important are the very human skills. So as we think about problem solving, strategic thinking, like almost like classic when you think about what a consultant gets hired for out of undergrad, those are the types of things that I think actually matter more, not a specific technical skill set, because the reality is you can learn that, or an agent will do it anyway. And so I have one client that's talking about their early in career strategy a lot, because you do need a pipeline. And so I think where they're headed is, how do we make the roles of our most junior folks actually like the next level or the next 2 levels up in terms of complexity, in terms of importance, in terms of like, there's no such thing as like an intern job anymore. It's actually like, what is a very important and useful job to the business that somebody junior can do, because they already do have a lot of the skills that are required. And I think that's an important flip, because otherwise we're going to end up saying, like, there are no junior people, and then what do we do in 5, 10 years? So that's at least the Charlotte answer to, I think, where we're headed. Yeah.
So specifically on your rewiring processes end to end, we're going through that internally. You had a great state of the workforce report into last year, and so we started up a digital shared services function where their job is solely to just look at the processes we do, decide what needs to be thrown out, not learned after 2 days. It can't just be HR, it has to be across the organization. I think I would love your perspective on what juice is worth the squeeze in terms of that process redesign, or what's the secret sauce been to evaluating those processes as opposed to just getting some quick wins and layering technology or AI or automation on top of exactly how it happens today?
No, I think that's such a good question. I'll start, but you should add. I think what I'm seeing first and foremost with a lot of the workflow process redesign work that I'm seeing is there's a lot of stuff that we do today that we should just not do. So some of this is like, yeah, of course, let's figure out how an agent can support it. But I actually think the work that I'm seeing that's most effective is like clean sheet process redesign. As in, sure, let's map out everything that's broken with the process, absolutely. But let's actually say, like, if we could do this now, what would we do? Yeah, we've got 100 people doing it today, but here's how it would actually work if we started kind of from a blank sheet of paper. And so I think a lot of times what we're finding is like, stop doing half of what you were doing today, the different handoffs, syndication points, things like that. And then it's actually realizing where do you like add back agents to help you make that process more efficient. But it's not, I keep saying that it's like not particularly sexy work to get the workflow redesigned right, because it's actually like AI is the last step in my mind of that journey. It's first starting with what should this process be? What should the outcomes be that we're driving towards? And how do we simplify it radically in terms of what we actually need to do to make it work? And then from there, let's figure out what agentic capabilities we need to make it happen. But I think what I liked about your question is like, where are we just throwing AI on top of it is exactly the way a lot of clients are thinking that they need to stop. It's not just about like taking a process, throwing a use case on and calling it a day. It's actually starting with like, should this process even exist? And then if yes, let's figure out how to make that work instead. But I don't know, Charles, what would you add?
No, I think I agree with everything Charlotte just said. I would say also one of the places where I think people are seeing a lot of success in terms of bringing other folks along is to say, how do you take the lens of meeting people where they are with different stakeholder groups? So how do you look at a process end to end and say, what are the biggest pain points? And can I use a lens of what are the biggest pain points that make our colleagues the most irritated in their day-to-day? What are the biggest pain points that make our customers the most irritated with having to do business with us? And can we use those to solve these different components so that at the end of the day, yeah, we have processes that are more efficient. We have areas of the organization we've looked at maybe based on, where there's cost or how we're actually driving increased sort of streamlined ability to do business. But at the end of the day, we can also point to it and say, hey, we heard you loud and clear. This was the part of the job that you don't get energy from. We fixed that. There's something, I think, very real to be said for that component of it, too.
Yeah, so that's loud. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the hiring pipeline. You mentioned 1.3 million resumes, and presumably you're using AI in that process. But how have you thought about managing risks as you've integrated, say, agentic AI into that? And specifically, have you done anything to make sure that, for example, like you don't amplify bias in the recruiting process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for many people processes in particular, when we think about analytics and all of that, using AI as a sort of red team, blue team approach becomes really important. So I'd say sort of there's 3 pieces of it. The first is being really clear on what processes you are and are not willing to involve AI in, and where do you feel like from a risk standpoint, there's you have a clear view. And I'd say on that one in particular, not just for recruiting, but across the board, thinking cross-functionally and bringing in colleagues from other parts of the organization, colleagues from legal to understand where there's places where there's more risk, less risk, what does that drive in terms of efficiency becomes really important. The second thing is being really thoughtful about where there is bias and using AI also to point out places where you're not using AI, if there may be bias also has been really useful. And so we see a lot of our clients in both recruiting, but also in terms of performance management. So as they're going through annual processes using AI to help augment your actual calibration sessions to start to point out places where you might have bias. And by the way, looking at that in terms of succession planning too, I think becomes really, really interesting. And I'd say the last piece is appropriately training people. I heard we had a great CHRO client describe it like AI is a great employee, but they're like a summer intern. You're not going to take something from the summer intern and give it to the CEO without looking at it first. Same idea. How do you train people in the organization to know When do you use this as a starting point? What do you have to do to it? In what setting? That becomes super critical. I don't know if you'd add anything.
No, I was just thinking, the only thing I'm even noticing from a McKinsey perspective is like, we now have this tool, this is for performance reviews versus hiring, but where they're helping, an agent is helping, as you're collecting all this feedback, like I have to talk to 20 people for my evaluees so I can understand what their jobs are and how they're doing in those jobs. It actually will flag for me now both bias in that conversation and also as I'm writing things, whether I'm saying it even just like with a tone of voice. Like I never thought that was something that I had to worry about, to be honest. And I realized, wait a second, I need to check myself a little bit. And the conversations that are very casual in tone, we need to kind of also reset our expectations. So I think, yes, there is risk of bias, obviously, in what the agents will produce or what AI can do. But boy, are humans biased too. So I think it's actually been a helpful flag for me, at least, as just like a participant in a lot of the processes that John's been helping lead. Anything else? Yeah.
So as a CHRO, we've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years is doing a lot of human-centered design, customer journey mapping. Is that a good basis to start from? Because you're kind of saying clean sheet, so I kind of feel like, here we go again, everything we just did, throw it out the window. So can we start from like customer journey maps and look at how do we do that and where we can plug in different places for Agentic or whatever?
No, hey, that's good work to have done. Don't worry. I'm not saying start from scratch there. I think like what I've been doing with my clients that are going through this HR reimagining is something like that, where we say, okay, here is the optimal like happy path solution for how we would imagine engaging with our employees. And we do a bit of a visioning exercise that does feel like backed in employee data, customer data, what have you, so that we're saying, okay, what is the vision for what we want to be? It's almost like AI agnostic of how we talk about it though, because it's about what are the magical moments with employees that we do want to have? Where do we want humans involved versus not? And so I think it's probably for you all, it's looking back at that again, refreshing it, seeing, can we be bolder? Can we be more provocative? I think this like 20-30 frame is actually helpful of like, be tech unconstrained and think about how you'd rewire the way work gets done. But I mean, you don't actually need to start with a blank sheet if you've already done some of that visioning. I think it's like, where can you crank it up a little bit? Cool.
Outstanding. Thank you, Charlotte and John.